Can you say something about Purim 1953? What does it mean for the Jewish people?
Well, I'll tell you, I did not know in 1953, in the beginning of March, that it is Purim. I didn't know the word Purim. And even 10 years later, I didn't know the word. But what did happen that day? Stalin died.
Collapsed.
And, collapsed. And I am coming from the kindergarten. And my father explains to me, to 5-year-old kid, that Stalin was a butcher, killed a lot of people, that we Jews were next in line, that that he was going to send us to Siberia. But now that he's dead, we are saved. That I should remember all my life that miracle happened, that Stalin died, but I should not tell it to anybody. I should do what everybody does. And next day I go to kindergarten. I am crying together with all the children about the death of Stalin. I am singing songs, how grateful we are to the son of all the people, Stalin, for this happy childhood. And I remember that miracle happened, I should be happy, Stalin died. That's how I started the life of loyal Soviet citizen, double thinker, who lives simultaneously in two worlds. One world of lies, when you are saying what you are told to say, when you are voting the way you are told to vote, when you are reading the books which you are permitted to read, and you know that there is another truth which you have to keep only for your family. That's how my life of Soviet slave started, and it finished many years after, on the day when I decided to say publicly that I am a proud Jew who wants to live for Israel.
Mr. Sharansky, do you think that on Purim we should celebrate also that the Haman of our days collapsed and disappeared?
Well, no doubt that is there must be some very serious meaning of this, because really Stalin, who was the two most awful figures of the 20th century, who killed tens of millions of its own citizens, who was preparing after Holocaust, new Holocaust for Jews who survived in the former Soviet Union, and who died really in the last moment when everything was already, all this campaign was launched, prepared already, all the letters which had to be published, which had to start this campaign, were written already, all the signatures were collected, the barracks were built in Siberia, and that in the very last moment, the fate changed like in the Purim tale.
As a child, it was, I assume, 1953, or maybe the winter of 1952, that I walked in the street with my father, and all of a sudden, it was in Riga, we were stopped by two Russian Soviet officers that demanded from my father to give his documents to check who he is. To identify. My father was very tensed. He asked, what's the reason for that? And the officer told, you look very suspicious to me, which meant he looks Jewish, and it was the time of all the plot of the doctors. And especially as a child, I was very afraid. I was afraid that my father may be arrested. And when it passed away, I forgot. But later, I remember something else. I played in the yard, and I come back home, and all of a sudden I saw that all the electricity is being put off. It is dark in our apartment, and my mother is sitting on the floor and crying, having a newspaper in her hand. So I asked Mama, what's happening? She told me, Stalin passed away. How can we able to continue without him? He is our father, She would know that her brother, a very prominent communist in Latvia, was killed by Stalin in 1937. And still Jews loved this leader. They were blind. And I think that it's a normal problem of the majority of people. People are always blind. People never know and not interested to know. They forget. But it is a challenge of the leaders not to forget and make a conclusion. Never count what people would say, what the majority would say. you have ice, you have wheat, and it's obvious that only solution of all the Jewish problems is being in Israel, in our independent country.
When Stalin died, I worked there with scientists in that research institute with people who were members of the Academy of Sciences and people who had other things to do than praise Stalin and shout communistic ideas. A meeting was called immediately where the party secretary of the institute, who before becoming party secretary was a cleaning lady. It is all right, there's nothing wrong with a cleaning lady, but you must remember that there were people of international reputation in that institute who worked in Paris, Berlin, or the United States before they came in a silly way, like myself, back to Hungary. This lady started crying with tears, and we sat there. The atmosphere was good at the institute because we knew exactly who was a spy and who was not. When he was there, then everybody behaved. And if he was not there, we told each other jokes about Stalin or Rakosi or who we thought about. And we looked at each other and smiled. There was in that institute a glass technician. Now, maybe you wouldn't believe it, but it is true. Not only you could not buy anything of luxury there, even only one or two kinds of shoes, for example, but laboratory glasses like alembics and so on had to be made, handmade. It could not be bought or ordered. It didn't exist. It was a separate laboratory within this institute, very old. He was not very old compared to me now, but he was old at that time. I was in my 20s. Mr. Makult, Comrade Makult, of course, then, an old man who was an old social democrat and trade unionist, who was a master in blowing glass, like the Venetians, you know. Really a fantastic old gentleman. And when this party secretary started crying, this old man who was fearless, not loud, but he said so that many people could hear, he should have done that maybe 20 years ago. It did not take more than half an hour, and the customary black car stopped at the gate, and two people came up to the hall and took this master glass blower away. Let me finish just this story. A couple of days later, his dead body was delivered to his family.
Thank you.
What do you remember from the time when Stalin collapsed on Purim 1953? How did the kibbutz Hashomer HaTzair react to this?
I must say, basically, we were all sympathizers of the Soviet Union for simple reasons. This is the site from which we expected our lives to be saved. When the Red Army will conquer Czechoslovakia back as it lost it to the Germans in 1939. So no doubt we were great sympathizers of the Soviet Union, of the Soviet partisans, of the Soviet army, and of its leader, who was Stalin. We had no reason to doubt except for the political machinations of Molotov-Ribbentrop time before the war. But Stalin was a mythological figure. We didn't know about his personal things. The only thing for which he was known already as openly anti-Semitic was the doctor's trial. Anyway, I can remember very clearly, but it's not from my own memory, when Stalin turned his back to Israel and the Jews. Soviet Union supported the creation of Israel. And the day when the Soviet delegate in the United Nations, Andrei Gromyko, he was the foreign minister, declared that the Soviet Union supports the creation of two states in Palestine, which means recognizing the Jewish state. It was a holiday. It was nothing less than a holiday, because we didn't know which way the Soviet Union will openly declare its, this was 47, its links and its help to young Israel. Without Soviet help, I don't know if Jerusalem will remain in Jewish hands because of the Czech arms that came into the country. And so these were among friends. And I know from later knowledge when this changed, when the relationship or diplomatic relationships between Israel and Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union began. It happened for the first time in the existence of Soviet Union that an Israeli diplomat is visiting Moscow, living in Moscow, representing Israel in Moscow, and coming on Sabbath to the synagogue. And Jews knew it or supposed it, and thousands of Jews came to the synagogue and around the synagogue in Moscow the day when Golda Meir arrived there for the first time. And as I know also from my friends who lived at the time in the Soviet Union, Soviet Jews, the crackdown on these open relationships happened when Stalin or his guys perceived that there is a big population that his heart is outside the Soviet Union. This is the way I understand this reaction of the Soviet regime at this time. But still, it was within the relationships and it was within Soviet support of Israel. Here was Ambassador Yershov. It was something entirely new. The state of Israel has diplomatic relations with Soviet Union. This was new and we received it enthusiastically. I would say that there was a kind of double image of Stalin. Stalin, the victor over Hitler, Stalin, the guy who led the Soviet army to free us, to free Czechoslovakia, to bring our lives back, and Stalin who persecutes Jewish doctors. It didn't work together. Somehow it was some kind of I would say, split sympathy. Anyway, the day of Purim came up, and the news of Stalin's death must have arrived to our isolated kibbutz in the week before Purim. What do we do as this mythical figure died? Will we take notice? Will we say something in his honor? Will we drinking and dancing and happily singing when this major event in world politics and in sympathy toward Israel, which Stalin represented for quite a few years.